Hi everyone. I've been reading this book by Joe Gallagher about the King's Indian defense. It's called Starting Out, the King's Indian. And Joe Gallagher, by the way, is a British Grandmaster. He was the national British champion in 2001. And we're going to look at a couple games that he had. He analyzes in the book, but he also played these games as black. So this is the King's Indian defense here, and if white plays knight f3, castles bishop e2, then that's called the classical variation, which I studied in detail in my previous video. Okay, so here black attacks white's center with e5. And now a very, not very rare, but a rare move here by white is to exchange pawns. And this is called the exchange variation. And so white's point is he'd like to get the queens off the board and just play an equal endgame and avoid a lot of theory. And Gallagher says this is kind of the chicken way out of facing the King's Indian defense. And in fact, he says in this kind of position, it's actually white who has to play very accurately just to maintain the equality. So white does take the queens off the board, and then you'll notice there's a pawn hanging on e5. White doesn't take it. He pins the knight with bishop g5. Most players do not take that pawn because there's a small tactic in the position. Black can take a pawn back because he's just unleashed an attack on the white knight. So maybe white exchanges knights here. And I'd prefer black in this position simply because that bishop is exerting some pressure on b2. So white players don't usually do that. So I think an improvement is to play this move bishop to g5. So you're pinning the knight to the rook, and now you are threatening knight takes e5. So black sidesteps the pin and defends e5. And now white plays knight d5, and that's a fork. You're forking the c7 point and the f6 point. So that forces black's hand. He has to trade knights, and then black tries to break down the central pawn structure here. Now white doesn't take on c6 and help black develop. Instead, he plays bishop c4, and then the pawns get traded, and now knight to d7 comes. So knight d7 is a really subtle threat that illustrates how accurately grandmasters play a game of chess. This position looks a little boring to me. It looks pretty equal, but black's move just made a subtle threat. Black is threatening to put that knight on the f6 square. And if he gets that knight to the f6 square, let's have a look. Let's say white makes a non-move and he puts that knight there. Then he's going to win the bishop pair. There's nothing white can do to preserve both bishops. This bishop is under attack. If he leaves it there, black can take it. If he moves it away to some safe square, then he drops the e4 pawn. Or white can lose the other bishop. He can take the knight with the dark squared bishop. So black is threatening to win the bishop pair. And in a position like this where everything else looks equal, the bishop pair is one of the few things you can strive for to try to get a slight advantage. So because of that, white plays knight to d2 to defend the e4 point. So now if the knight comes to f6, the bishop can move away. The knight doesn't come to f6 though, it goes to c5. All right, and now white plays what Gallagher calls an inaccuracy. He plays knight to c4. Looks pretty good to me, getting the knight more active, and it's heading for this d6 point here. But Gallagher says that knight needed to defend the e4 pawn a little longer, and plus the knight isn't going to be stable. In fact, black plays bishop to f8 and stops it from coming to d6, and black is threatening to push the pawn to b5 and drive the knight back anyway. So Gallagher says that a better move is just to leave that knight there and castle long in this position. All right, but he moves the knight to c4, and we're going to see the consequences of that. Bishop to f8 stops the knight from going to d6. Now white castles long, which I think can be a little dangerous, even with the queens off the board. The king looks a little open on that side of the board. We're going to see another game in a moment where white castles short in the exact same position. Okay, now bishop e6, and that's a tactical threat. Okay, black is threatening to take the pawn on e4. For example, if white makes some non-move, then you're taking that pawn, because if you get the knight, then black gets the other knight. So black would win a pawn there. Actually, he is dropping this b7 pawn, but that simply activates this rook down the b file then at that point. So that's what black is threatening. White doesn't play h3, of course, but he does kind of ignore that threat. He plays king to b1, trying to get the king a little safer, getting it off the open c file. And black decides he wants to strive for a little bit more than knight takes e4. He keeps that threat hanging in the position and tries to improve the idea by playing rook a c8, okay, activating the rook on the c file. All right, well now white kind of ignores the e4 point, and he probably should have played rook h e1 and just stopped that knight from ever taking there. But instead he plays bishop to e3 and allows that tactic. Okay, but this time you see that black has activated his rook from the a file to the c file, so that after white takes the knight, he can take back with the rook. And so now black's rooks are going to be more active than they were before in that other line that we saw, where black didn't play rook a c8 first. White does take the b7 pawn, but now the situation with the rooks is, in the previous case there was a rook on b8, and now there's one on c4. So let's see what happens. So rook b8 drives the bishop back. It goes to d5, bishop to f5 check, king goes in the corner, and then you get a rook to the 7th rank here. So rook to c2. Okay, so white at this point was thinking, he was foreseeing this position, and he was thinking he was going to play bishop to b3 and protect this point. There's a couple of rooks pointed at it, drive that rook out of there. That was his intent. But at the last minute, he saw that that move loses. That move loses because black has rook takes b3, a takes b3, followed by rook to c6, threatening an unstoppable mate here on the a file. There's nothing white can do to stop that mate. So once he saw that bishop to b3 failed, he kind of panicked, and he just ignored the b2 point and played bishop takes a7. Big mistake. Rook b takes b2, and now there are two rooks on the 7th rank, and this is just a huge advantage to have your rooks doubled on the 7th rank like that. Okay, white brings his bishop back, but now black has an unstoppable mate. So you'll see his idea. He plays bishop to b4. White makes some move, doesn't matter what. He could not stop that bishop from coming to c3, and then white resigned. So black has an unstoppable mate threat. He can just retreat this rook somewhere down the b file and release a check with the bishop, and that would be a checkmate. And there's nothing white can do except delay the inevitable. So white resigned. So let's take a look at a second game that Gallagher played as black. And this one transposes into the King's Indian. I wanted to take a look at how that can happen. So knight f3, knight f6, c4. Now, as black, if you like the King's Indian defense, you can essentially play the King's Indian defense as a setup against almost anything that white plays. So you're going to get this position where your bishop is fianchettoed, your knight is on f6, and you're going to put your pawn on d6, and you're going to castle short. So you can do that against almost anything. And that's what black does. And eventually, they transpose to this classical variation right here. And then we're back to the same position as the last game. And they play the exchange variation. The queens come off. The knight gets pinned. The rook sidesteps the pin. Knight comes to d5, forking c7 and f6. So trade of knights is forced. c6 is played. Bishop c4. Pawns get traded. So we're following the last game, knight to d7. That was that long discussion we had about the threat against the bishop pair. So white plays knight d2 to support e4. Knight comes to c5. And white makes the same move that Gallagher calls an inaccuracy, knight to c4. And bishop to f8 stops that knight from getting into d6. This time, though, white castles short instead of long. So that's the first new move. Let's see how black handles this position. Okay, bishop to e6. So just like before, there's a threat here of knight takes e4. So a little tactic. So this time white takes the bishop and the rook recaptures. And if I were to look at this position just for a minute, I would think it's pretty equal. It's pretty boring. The pawn structure is symmetrical. Those knights are symmetrically placed. Both sides are castled short. Doesn't look like either side has an advantage. But Gallagher thinks that black has a clear strategical advantage here because he's going to get a tempo on the white knight, and that's going to have to be driven back. This bishop is kind of off sides over here, and black's going to activate his rooks faster. So black's pieces are just slightly better in this otherwise symmetrical position, and that can make a difference. You can get an initiative by having better pieces. Not to mention white has to respond to the threat on his e4 pawn right now, so that ties his hands. So white plays f3, b5 drives the knight back. It's a good square for the knight. It can come to that nice outpost on d5. h6 drives the bishop back. And already you can start to see black's position slightly improving and looking better than white's. And now he plays knight d3. And that's a strong place to put the knight, threatening the b2 pawn. White temporarily ignores that with knight to d5, posts his knight in the center. And so he's threatening a fork here of the rooks. So black doesn't have time to take on b2, but he just activates his rook onto the open c-file. And now white does have to do something about the threat on b2. He pushes the pawn, and then black gets a rook to the 7th rank again, just like in the last game. So just kind of out of nowhere, from a position I would have thought was completely equal, I really strongly prefer black right now. I don't know if the engine does. Let me turn the engine on. No, the engine says it's equal, but you have to play like an engine. Humans would probably easily prefer black here. Okay, but anyway, game proceeds rook f d1, which threatens the knight. The knight goes to b4, trying to trade off white's excellent centralized knight on that outpost there. White does trade, and now black's bishop comes to life. White tries to get his bishop back into the game, and he does it with tempo against that a7 pawn, but watch what's going to happen. a6, a3 threatens black's bishop, and now bishop to d2. I love that move. You've heard of getting 2 rooks on the 7th rank, and that can paralyze your opponent, but watch how this rook and bishop pair together to completely paralyze white in this position. There's nothing white can do as black slowly improves his position. That bishop is well placed. It's guarding these back rank squares here. So you can't get this rook over here to eject that rook. This bishop is stopping this rook from developing into the game. So black has complete control over the only 2 open files here, and white can't do anything about it. So black is strategically winning. Okay, bishop to c5 was played. a5, black is just going to slowly improve. King to f1, rook to c6 attacks the bishop. b4 defends, a4. Rook a b1 brings the king up. It's got all kinds of time. Look at that rook just move back and forth there. f5, expanding the pawns. King goes back to g1. Rook comes up toward the center, or king rather comes up toward the center. Rook to f1. There's really nothing white can do here. King to e6, and finally white cracks and misses a tactic. He plays rook to f2. Okay, so that was a tactical blunder. White is just losing now. So why is that such a bad move? Well, look at the placement of the king and the rook. This bishop would like to come to e3 and pin that rook and win the rook, win the exchange. There's a bishop here in the way, though. So what does black do? Well, he takes the bishop. And so now he is threatening to play rook to e3. And if white takes the rook, then you play that, and you're just crushing. There's nothing white can do in this position. So let's see, turn the engine on. Yeah, it says negative 5.5 here. It says, okay, run with the pawn or play rook f1, and then bishop takes. What happens if you take here? Well, there's rook c1 check, forcing the rook back. Oh yeah, and the king just comes in. Let's see. Oh, you can even push these pawns. You can just, yeah, you have a winning pawn breakthrough over there. So that's maybe the fate that awaited white if he had taken that rook on c5. But he doesn't. Instead, he decides to trade a pair of pawns here with check, and then he decides to take the bishop, and then rook takes rook and pawn takes rook. But then black just puts his rook back on c2 and white resigned. Okay. Now this position is negative 2.0 according to the engine, but I think it's just obviously winning for black. Black's going to pick up this pawn and be a pawn up, and he's not going to do it with his rook. He wants his rook to cut the white king off and keep the white king on the back rank here. So he's going to pick that pawn off with his king instead. And then you can get a passed pawn over here on this side of the board, and white's going to be paralyzed. You've got a centralized king, an extra pawn, a terrible king, a strong rook, and a potential for a very quick passed pawn. So there's nothing white can do. So white resigned. Okay, so Gallagher says that's how he likes to punish people who try to play the exchange variation against him when he does the King's Indian defense. All right, thanks for watching the video.